Hey y'all, Melissa here with you today, and today we are going to talk about muslins or toiles. That's M-U-S-L-I-N or T-O-I-L-E. What are they? When should you sew them? And how can this help your sewing? So, what is a muslin or a toile? Well, the name derives from this fabric actually. This is muslin fabric. It is unbleached cotton in a plain weave, and it doesn't have a ton of drape, and it's pretty easy to work with and manipulate. Like I can finger press it right here. You've probably seen videos or TV shows where people are using muslin fabric to create patterns on a dress form where they're draping with it. And that is one of the things it is used for. But it can also be handy to make a muslin when you are working from a pattern that somebody else already drafted. So, when should you make a muslin or a toile? These are mock-up versions of something that you're sewing, and I think they're useful, particularly in three instances. The first is when you are sewing a new pattern that you have not sewn for yourself before, especially if you do not fit some of the standard average pattern sizing. So for example, if you're taller or shorter than the average drafting height for that pattern, if your bust is bigger or smaller, if your bust and waist fall in different columns on the size charts, if you are in between the measurements, your measurements don't match up with any column on the size chart. Those are all instances where making a mock-up or muslin of the garment will help you make sure that you get a garment that fits you properly. The second time I think it's really helpful, even if you've made a pattern before, I think it can be really helpful to make a muslin if you are going to be using really expensive or precious to you fabric. And that's just to make sure that you've got the fit perfect and that you know how to do all the techniques in the garment so that when you cut into that expensive fabric, you're still going to get a garment that fits you. And the third time I think it's useful is when there are new techniques that you're going to be practicing in this pattern. So if there's some kind of placket that you haven't sewn before or something, it can be helpful to make the sample mock-up with muslin so that you can make sure that when you do your final garment that everything is going to work correctly and you know how to do the technique. So when you make a muslin, do you cut out the entire pattern? Like, am I recommending that you make an entire garment out of this fabric that you're never going to wear? Doesn't that seem wasteful? And yes, I agree, it does seem wasteful, and that's why I don't cut out the entire pattern. So for example, here is a bodice from a pattern that I was making for somebody who was going to need a full bust adjustment, and we needed to check the arms and where that was going to hit her because she's a little shorter than average, etc. So this is the muslin I made, and here are things you can notice that I skipped. First of all, I only sewed one sleeve, because we only needed to fit her on one side to make sure that that sleeve was going to fit. Now you would sew both sleeves if somebody had some kind of asymmetry in their body. They would need to be fitted on both sides. But as far as generally, I will only sew one sleeve. So that saves me some fabric. You'll notice that I did not sew my facings for the neckline because I just needed to know that it fit on her bust and that these seams were falling in the proper place. So I cut off the seam allowance for the neckline so we could see where it would hit her, but I didn't sew a facing on, so I didn't have to cut facings. That was more fabric that I didn't do. And as you can also see, even though this was a dress, we didn't cut a skirt out at all because we knew we were going to be doing a gathered skirt that was plenty full to fit around her hips. So really, as long as we got the waist fitted, we knew the rest of it would fit fine. This was the part that was going to need alteration, so this is the part that we sewed as a muslin. The next question is, do you always use muslin fabric to make your muslin? And not necessarily. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Here are some instances where I do not use muslin fabric. So here's the first one, is this t-shirt here is a stretch t-shirt. I cannot make this out of muslin fabric because this is woven. It doesn't stretch. I won't be able to tell if this is going to fit the way I want it because I need the stretch. This is a garment that has negative ease. Like, it doesn't go to the seam lines here around my bust. However, it will perfectly easily stretch, and so I needed to sew it in stretch fabric to make sure that the neckline was going to fall where I wanted it and that it was going to have the proper amount of negative ease to fit the way that I wanted it. So you can see that I've got this large bolt of fabric here, and this is just, I bought some cheap knit fabric. It doesn't have a great pattern on it. I probably wouldn't wear this out personally, but it does have 4-way stretch, and I can use this if I need to make a muslin for a knit stretch fabric garment. The other time I may not use the same muslin fabric is if I'm doing something as a demonstration. So for this t-shirt here that I eventually sewed, and it has, I'll show you the close-up video here, it has these kind of folded origami bamboo sleeves here. And in order to demonstrate how to do that, I wanted to sew it first of all on a woven fabric because it's easier to see the creases where when I was using a woven fabric. Secondly, I wanted to make sure to use a fabric where you could tell the wrong side and the right side apart. So that's why I used a print, because I wanted to be able to see where was the right side, where was the wrong side, so that it was easier to tell where I was sewing to get this pleated design. So that is another time that I might not use muslin fabric, but you never have to use muslin fabric. I realize not everybody goes and buys themselves a bolt of muslin like I do to help myself with pattern development. You can literally sew with any inexpensive fabric that has the same characteristics as your final garment. So for example, again, if you're sewing a knit garment, you're going to want to sew with knit fabric for your muslin, but it just has to be similar amounts of stretch. You can sew with muslin fabric, but you can also use old sheets. Like maybe you've got old bed sheets that have threadbare spots so you don't use them on the bed anymore. Don't throw those away. You can save the fabric and then you can use that when you're making these mock-up garments. And that reuse of fabrics that might have otherwise gotten thrown away is a great way to be sustainable with your sewing. Once I sew up a muslin and I've derived all the fitting information I need from it and I have transferred those alterations to my pattern, then I cut these up. And once I cut them up, I tend to use the pieces and sew them into these like knot paper towels that we use around my house. And you can see in this post how I use my old muslins to make these knot paper towels and use the fabric yet again.